Hi, my name is Daniel. I really love movies and Chucky, and today I'm going to rank the entire Chucky franchise, including the movies and the TV series. Out of all the horror characters, not the franchises, this is the one I'd say I have the most history with. He was one of the first major horror icons I became aware of, as far back as the Van Helsing DVD when I was super young. Watching that movie at that age was enough, but to see this trailer on there, it still traumatizes me, even though, yes, it's miles scarier than the actual film. Anyway, I was in about 3rd or 4th grade when me and my family were at a Walmart, and I laid my eyes on this particular DVD collection. That particular image of his face, obviously, was just very traumatizing, but I had this strange pull towards it. One of those instances where you feel like this genre chooses you. I remember I just kept thinking and talking about it more and more, watched all the YouTube videos I could on the franchise, and eventually, my mom bought that collection and the rest was history. A character that went as far back as my nightmares, that I would not only meet the voice of, but even before that, become both synonymous and like a celebrity of sorts with. See, in October 2021, me, Chucky, and even Annabelle would enter this costume contest at a certain nightclub called 340. Yes, I've got the trick-or-treat doll. I've got multiple trick-or-treat dolls, and I remember I brought them there multiple times and y'all were in love. And almost all the times I would go after that, y'all would be like, hey, you were Chucky, and I was living for it. To any of y'all who clicked on this video because of that, first of all, thank you. Second, didn't you ever wonder what I thought about the movies and all that? Because trust me, I did not spend $700 on all them dolls for nothing. Well, regardless of how you know me, this is just my opinion, I'd love to hear yours, but without further ado, here's my ranking. In last place is going to be Cult of Chucky. Yeah, I'm very surprised it's ended up here, but to be very frank, it's here because it's what I think, looking back after so long, killed the franchise. A fact made more and more apparent of where it would go from here. This movie, even when it first came out, was an example of what I like to call a Trojan horse. After Curse brought the series back to its horror roots after Seed, this one starts off with that horror energy, but then makes this dramatic shift into that Seed level type of energy, if not completely worse. Even more, this movie teased a lot too, and by the time it was over, didn't measure up to what it did. We had the return of Alex Vincent as Andy Barclay and Tiffany after having these small roles in the last movie, only for them to be ultimately underutilized. And I was looking forward to their returns the most. Well, Andy more than Tiffany, and what type of roles they'd have in the story, to be honest. Especially with how the last one ended. But anyways, the asylum setting that ends up taking much of the focus was not only uninteresting, but also obvious, especially for a horror sequel. This movie was honestly kind of boring, and now just kind of pointless, really. It barely feels like a movie too, in the sense that there's a beginning and a middle, but almost way too many ends, and for the first time, a cliffhanger. At least a massive, or a few massive ones. I get that now it was all set up for the TV series, but back then, how are we supposed to know that? But speaking of the TV series, and finally, how this one ruined the franchise, introducing that plot device where Chucky finds this spell where he can split his soul into multiple dolls at once. A little spoilers, and so I don't have to keep bringing it up when I talk about the seasons of the TV show. From this spell and this point, Chucky has become way too overpowered. Speaking in a present tense, the voodoo elements of this series have never been more convenient, and it all started here. In 10th place is going to be Child's Play 3. This one grew on me, but only slightly. For the most part, it's an obvious example of a sequel rushed into production to capitalize on the success of the last movie. It's to the point where the cast and crew, including the voice of Chucky himself, didn't like it. Like I described the Nightmare on Elm Street remake and my ranking of those movies, this movie is depressing. Not so much depressing as in the feeling, but rather in the sense that there's little to absolutely nothing engaging. I'll call this new phrase I'm inventing from all of that cinematically depressing. The military school setting was a nice change of pace, sure, but it just ends up feeling like the bare minimum with, yes, how cliched it is. If there's anything I do like about it, well, as always, Brad Dourif gives it his all. We get some okay Chucky action, and seeing an older version of Andy Barclay was actually somewhat interesting, but only somewhat. I really don't have that much else to say, to be honest. Not only do I just want to move on to my next picks, but when I marathon these, I normally like to skip this one altogether. It's only higher than Cold, which I might skip even more, to be honest, because at least it's not as frustrating. Speaking of frustrating though, but somehow to a lesser degree, in 9th place is going to be Chucky Season 2. Long story short, no pun intended, the story of this one was just one big mess. A big mess that at the same time and in this very awkward sense, I kind of love to hate, like this whole TV series really. But with this season, mostly just hate. It all started when they threw away what I thought was this massive potential they set up perfectly at the end of the last season. All in favor of a story that was largely unfocused, didn't seem to have a clear objective, and seemed to run off way too many random and weird pop culture references. And by the time things did start to pick up, not only was this season halfway over, but then they gave us what could have been the perfect ending of the whole franchise that they more than dumped down the drain. This perfect ending that somehow, even though it didn't end up sticking, was enough for me to put it at this spot on the list. You can take that with a huge grain of salt though, because how did they end this and in the process undo that perfect ending? They give us this ridiculous plot twist that was not only very unceremonious, but also a completely contrived reason to keep this truly died a long time ago series going. But in 8th place is going to be Chucky Season 3. This season was leagues better than Season 2 in that they finally gave us an exciting new location, the White House, which I think they surprisingly utilized pretty well. I loved how we were even starting to see some of that scary Chucky again after, well, a lot of Season 2. Honestly though, it's conflicting at the same time. As much as some of these over-the-top moments might actually work for the Chucky character, the way the humor got in Season 2 made the series as a whole start to feel like a parody of itself. So Season 3 was almost this return to form. Keyword, almost. Because by the end, things once again go right down the drain. All of that completely undermined what I thought was this really genius storyline of Chucky starting to die because he was getting old. And there was even more depth to that, considering that this storyline was starting to ground the series again. With Voodoo, which was probably the most convenient in Season 2, not being the easy way out this time. I mean, here's the thing. Yes, horror movie villains always come back. Chucky even said so himself.
I'll be back. I always come back.
But it was in this point that we were stuck in this loop where, for a movie in 3 seasons now, we haven't gotten and have needed at least some type of temporary defeat. Especially for how overpowered both Chucky and Tiffany have become. As far as one of the bigger flaws of this season though, these main characters had never fallen flatter for me. Also by this point, I think it was safe to say, even as far back as Season 1, that their storylines had more than lost their steam. Which is why I'm both not surprised, if not a little glad, that they finally canceled the show here. So from this point forward, these are all installments that I don't so much love one more than the other, but rather can watch all of these and not have that many gripes with them. And in 7th place is going to be the Child's Play remake from 2019. I kinda wanted to put this one higher, but this was a had to trust my gut situation. I have some interesting nostalgia with this one, and with a few of my higher picks, that's going to be a recurring theme. And it goes a lot deeper when the said nostalgia I have for these come from discovering them at high points in my life. In some ways, Chucky, or at least the earlier Chucky anyway, is like my comfort horror character. This was the first Chucky movie I ever watched in theaters during my first trip back to California after I hadn't been here since I was 5, before I realized I wanted to move back out here. Even deeper, and for some reason, this is one of my broadest memories of that pre-COVID era. Not to get too off topic, but speaking of the past, I remember this one having quite the divide before it came out. Not only was this a remake, but it was also a roadblock at a time when we really wanted answers after Cult. Me, I don't think I ever had a strong opinion on it, to be honest. I just wanted to see Chucky again, especially in a theater. Granted, of course, there were others in my lifetime that both went straight to DVD, one more deserving than the other. And this one? Not to be too dramatic, but it was absolutely what theaters were made for. I know I had a very fun experience and audience when I first saw it. Again, that pre-COVID realness. It's a surprisingly fun modern update of the original that, dare I say, even did some things better than it and didn't just straight up copy it. Some examples include making Detective Mike Norris much more of a fun character and delving more into Andy's home life. Yes, the new Andy and his friends are a little Stranger Things, but a lot more engaging than the otherwise TikTok-inspired characters of the TV series, which this movie has surprisingly stood the test of time against. The second and third seasons anyway, for sure. If we want to talk the bigger differences between all the original movies and this one though, I think Mark Hamill is not better, but nearly just as good as Brad Dourif in the voice of Chucky. At the same time though, and what brings this one right here, it just doesn't have that certain feel that I find so specific to and love about those original movies. But I can still appreciate this one as its own. If anything, I'll consider this the bridge movie, the one that's literally right at the midpoint, between the ones I have stronger feelings about versus the ones I have better feelings about, which, and to start off in 6th place, is going to be Bride of Chucky. The fun middle of the road installment that literally takes place in the middle of the road. For a first try at doing almost full comedy, I think this one balanced the horror elements quite well out of all the more comedic ones. There's a whole lot to like about this one, to be honest. From those 90s Scream vibes, the gothic blue filter, and even the soundtrack, which I think this one has the best of. Not the musical score, even though that has its moments too, but entirely the pre-existing song soundtrack, just from the intro song alone.
Well, hello, Dolly.
This movie gave me this newfound appreciation for heavy metal, to be honest. It's very heavy in that vibe, no pun intended, and I was living for it. It really complemented that road vibe, which I think is one of the best parts of this movie. But of course, the absolute best part of this movie, the introduction of Jennifer Tilly as Tiffany. Especially after Child's Play 3, she was absolutely the breath of fresh air we needed. Her and Brad Dourif bounce off each other so well, but of course, they can only carry this movie so much before, towards that last act, it starts to run out of steam. Because of course, as much as they made Chucky more of a main character, we still had to have our human characters, and Jesse and Jade are the first of the weakest. And you've heard that before, so the way I'd describe them, they were a couple with drama ripped right out of, here it goes, Disney Channel, without all the charm and wittiness. But they're not insufferable, and this movie is very much still watchable, and an okay, if not pretty fun time. But in 5th place is going to be Seed of Chucky. To be fair, this and Bride tend to go very back and forth with me, as yes, they're pretty similar in terms of quality. However, unlike Bride, this one gets a lot of hate and is usually lower, if not the lowest on people's lists. But if you couldn't tell from my Nightmare on Elm Street ranking, I tend to and am sometimes going to be a lot kinder to these so-called worst installments of a few horror franchises. The thing is, I never hated, and with how it would nonetheless influence the vibe of the later entries, still don't hate this one. In fact, and to be very honest, I have a lot of good nostalgia for it. It is the first Chucky movie I ever watched at a time where I wasn't fully into horror movies, but started to become less scared of them. And I think, if I wasn't trying to get scared at least, I picked the right one to put into the DVD player first. Because I became less scared of horror because of this movie. Anyway, getting right to it, yeah, this movie has a ridiculous, if not completely nasty, and way too overtly sexual sense of humor that doesn't work. With stuff like this.
You're pissing your pants! You're pissing your pants! You're pissing your pants!
And yes, what I think is the very ick opening title sequence. But I'd say this movie, thinking about it now, has surprisingly aged well. Mostly though, on the comedic side of things. Unlike the TV series, seasons 2 and 3 more so, where the humor got way too over the top to a point where it was almost insulting the audience. There's some other humor in here that, past all the gross sexual stuff, actually kind of works for me. While it's still over the top, sure, it's in a way where it feels more campy and fun, as opposed to completely frustrating, again, like the TV series. What I'm mostly referring to here, and this might sound very specific, the performance of Jennifer Tilly, which, I could be wrong, doesn't get enough credit. This was certainly, on the comedic side of things, one of her best performances, and if I didn't say so already, one of the best parts of this movie. A movie that, while it still has its flaws and what would ultimately take the franchise out of theaters, I can see as this nice bookend. Even more, what would make all they set out to do in that next movie land much better. In fourth place is going to be Chucky Season 1. Okay, so as much as I've practically dragged half the show, I have to say that the first season was and still remains a pretty good / decent time. Just like with Cold, if I didn't mention, I watched the trailers for this on repeat and kept up with everything behind the scenes before this came out. It was an exciting time to be a Chucky fan again. The major difference between this and Cold is that when this finally came out, I didn't find myself all that disappointed and felt that by the end, there was a great payoff. A payoff that they would stupidly throw away at the start of the next season, but what at the time made this season feel like a wild ride. I think that for its first run on TV, it balanced the horror, comedy, and even the legacy elements quite well. It was almost like this highlight reel of the whole franchise. As far as the flaws, really, I just didn't like these new characters. It wasn't so much that they were CW style or, like I said earlier, TikTok-like teens. It was that their storylines felt very rushed. It made it hard to feel any emotional connection to these characters, if I ever did at all. Anyway, another thing I didn't really like about this season that it sold itself on was how they explored Charles Lee Ray's backstory. Not only was I not curious about it, but the flashbacks and times they did were underwhelming and just slowed things down. But to wrap things up here on a positive note, this is another entry where nostalgia has a lot to do with where I placed it. Where the 2019 remake was a very distinctive pre-COVID memory, this was a very distinctive post-COVID memory. I had not only just moved back to California, but when I won that contest with Chucky, it was like a personal chef's kiss. Not just to this era of Chucky, but to that point in my life. Again, shouting out to my old 340 gang, I had started going there several times before that, when I was still trying to find my feet here. And when I won that contest, because of you guys, I finally felt like I found my tribe here. I know this might be random for everyone else, but it felt like something nice to share for this video. In third place is going to be the original Child's Play. I don't really have that much to say about this one that hasn't been said before or isn't obvious, to be honest. But in short, yeah, it's basically just an introduction or pilot episode to the world and character of Chucky. While it wasn't perfect, it was indeed a classic. Just like with all the original movies of the franchises I've covered so far, I like to find distinctive qualities about them that made them stand out and what in turn stands out to me, or qualities that I think don't get enough recognition. With this one, not only did it perfect the killer doll, but this was one of, if not the first, of the 80s slashers to hone in on a new, younger perspective. Yes, we had Tommy Jarvis in the Friday the 13th franchise and Jamie Lloyd in the Halloween franchise, but the difference is that they weren't introduced until much later in their respective franchises, so it didn't exactly have that same gravitas, I guess you could say. Here, it's all from the get-go, and Andy Barclay is perhaps the best of the child slasher protagonists, in that he was up against a very new type of threat. What I think made Chucky really land as this new horror icon was the fact that he was, perhaps, one of the hardest horror characters others had to convince was real. Again, all the more effective from the perspective of a child, with a great performance by Alex Vincent. All that in mind, I think this movie has the most value in the fact that it was this unrealized breath of fresh air. Even though slashers were dying out, and this franchise was no exception to that decline, I'd say this movie was able to give them at least some bang before they ultimately did give out. In second place is going to be Curse of Chucky. I love how, even though I'm kinder with Seed, this wasn't just a return to form and not so much a highlight reel, but rather this massive celebration of the franchise. I'd even consider this along the lines of Scream 4, and feeling like this legacy sequel of sorts, way before they became popular. I love how it reintroduces and calls back to the entire franchise up to this point, and how entry-level this movie is. I mean, I had been very aware of Chucky at this point, but watching this for the first time felt like discovering him all over again, especially when, at the time I had first watched this movie, I was at a new point in my love of horror. Like I've been saying, a lot of nostalgia for these, and this was at that dramatic point where horror movies didn't really scare me all that much anymore. Speaking of not getting scared though, I will say that from a more objective standpoint, this was still Chucky at his scariest. Again, speaking objectively, this might just be the scariest Chucky movie in general. Like I've also said before, I really dislike haunted house movies, but I really clicked with the haunted mansion setting here, as well as the gothic vibes. In some ways, it was like the house was a character itself, or an obstacle considering that the main character was wheelchair bound. The main character of Nika, of course, who I think is one of the second best protagonists of this franchise after Andy Barclay. The fact that she was even played by Brad Dourif, the voice of Chucky's daughter, was just a chef's kiss. Anyways, what I really loved about this movie was the way they went back and explored Charles Lee Ray's backstory. I know I said I didn't like how they explored Charles Lee Ray's backstory in the TV series, but I more than didn't mind it here, especially with how it connected immediately back to the original. It made this movie feel like this culmination of the series. Or, like I said, this massive celebration of the franchise that makes even Seed feel like a part of this big dramatic journey. A big journey that sadly would come to an end, just as it seemed as this new one was starting. In all honesty, I think that this was the franchise's true final peak, and this would be a near perfect film if they had not only given us more like this, especially with how it ended, but also if I didn't feel so strongly, like many others, about my next pick. What I'd say is the actual perfect film, which is, and in first place, is going to be Child's Play 2. Even the trailer is iconic.
Sorry, Jack. Chucky's back.
From the production value, the score, and all the more Chucky action, this movie was not just an upgrade from the original, but the world and character of Chucky fully realized. From start to finish, this movie absolutely delivers. Of course, you've heard that all before, which is why, even if my thoughts on this movie still come short, I have something deeper I can share. When I had first watched this movie, I had just moved to a new school, and I was the new kid, just like Andy in this movie. Not only could I relate to him, but the relationship he forms with the new character of Kyle, one of my favorites, really gave me hope during that time when I really struggled to fit in. And I guess you could say that was the same energy when I first moved to California too. Maybe that's a little dramatic, but hey, what are movies for, right? But that was my ranking of the entire Chucky franchise. Up next, things are gonna look a little different. I'd say that for the rest of the year, I don't have any content planned out. Even though this is very early on, and I might not have the biggest audience yet, this has been very fun. For those who have been watching and or are invested in my content, well, and not to be dramatic, long story short, I started this channel at the beginning of this year when I was jobless, bored, and on top of all of that, getting over a really messy breakup. To be honest, I had always wanted to do this, but another long story short, a lot more went into it than I thought. Or a lot more goes into this than I thought. But I'll just say, that breakup I went through with a person that honestly held me back was this big push in a lot of ways. It's what I think unlocked this creative potential I had always known I wanted to have and act on. I'm not saying I am or ever will be perfect or anything, but this has not only helped me get over this breakup, but also changed me a whole lot as a person. And one other creative avenue that I already had some history with and was able to give a lot to was screenwriting. I think I had mentioned that before, but when I got some shit together earlier this year, I put a whole lot of focus on that. That's why, in case you ever get curious, I didn't upload anything in this particular 7th-month period. Anyways, eventually, I was hit with this really massive writing slump to where, if I'm being very honest, I became defeated and very depressed. I'll try not to get too personal, but yeah, I just couldn't write anything. But at the very least, or most with where I was, I just wanted to keep creating. Then I ended up back here, and the rest was history. And I feel like I came back a lot stronger in the sense that I really wanted to put more effort into this. Along with all of that, that deeper connection I feel to writing has lately been calling my name back. And that's why I'll be stepping away from here for a little bit. This hasn't gotten overwhelming by any means, but yes, it's a lot of work. And with the holidays coming up too, of course, I got a lot of exciting stuff happening. I also have a lot of interests. I want to find ways to balance them all out and just keep all my creative juices flowing. So for the time being, I plan on putting a lot more focus on writing. In many ways, this has been a part of that journey, and vice versa. When I come back though, hopefully in January, I'll be looking at and ranking both the Alien and Predator franchises. Until then, this has been Daniel. Happy holidays, and no matter what, keep loving movies.